The room was full of people who pretended they weren't listening. It was a rehearsal stage inside a big arena, hours before the doors opened. The empty seats rose into the darkness like a cliff. Work lights hung high and harsh, turning every face the same pale color. Crew members moved in quick lines, scaring cables, taping down cords, testing microphones. Someone laughed too loud near the side curtain, then stopped when the laughter didn't get answered. Jackson Browne stood at center stage with a guitar strapped across his chest, looking down at the set list in his hand. The paper felt thin, disposable, like the night could be rewritten at any moment. A few feet away, Glenn Frey leaned toward a monitor, talking to a sound tech with the quiet intensity of a man who needed everything to be perfect. Don Henley stood with his arms crossed, watching the lights above the stage as if he could will them into cooperation, and Joe Walsh, newest member, newest gravity, sat on a road case with one boot on the floor and one on the edge of the case, casually tuning a guitar. He looked relaxed in the way some people look relaxed when they're really just daring someone to challenge them. He strummed a chord, then another, letting them ring out louder than necessary. Jackson glanced at Joe and then back at the set list. He was here for one reason, to play a few songs, help an old friend, keep things smooth. That was what Glenn had said. Keep it smooth, make it fun. Nothing heavy, nothing complicated. But nothing about the air in this arena felt smooth. Joe looked up from his guitar like he'd been waiting for Jackson to meet his eyes. "So," Joe said, voice easy, almost playful, "we doing it your way tonight, or the way that doesn't put people to sleep?" A few crew members froze. Someone near the drum riser pretended to cough. The sound techs kept their hands busy without looking up. Jackson didn't move. He kept his gaze on Joe for a beat longer than comfort. "I'm doing it the way the song goes," Jackson said. Joe grinned like he'd been given permission to sharpen his knife. "Yeah, but songs can go a lot of ways, man. That's kind of the point." Glenn turned slightly, hearing it now. His face tightened for a second. Then he softened it the way he always did when the room was dangerous. The smile he used when he wanted to keep things light. "Let's just run it," Glenn said. "No speeches." Joe shrugged, as if he hadn't been poking at anything. "Sure, let's run it." Jackson adjusted his guitar strap and stepped closer to the microphone. He felt the eyes on him, not just from the band, from the crew, from people who knew when a room was about to split and wanted to see which way it went. He cleared his throat, not to speak, just to breathe. They started the song. It should have felt familiar. The chords were muscle memory. The melody lived in his hands like a habit. But with Joe playing beside him, the song felt like a different animal. Joe's guitar was louder, sharper, cutting across Jackson's rhythm like it was trying to claim the space. Not wrong, exactly, just dominant, like a voice that entered a conversation and slowly made everyone else speak quieter. Jackson held his part steady. He didn't compete, he didn't push. He stayed in the pocket, kept the timing honest, kept the sound grounded. That was his strength. Restraint. The ability to hold a line without needing to prove he could. They reached the chorus. Glenn leaned into his microphone. Don's harmonies came in clean. The sound was big, even in an empty arena, expensive, controlled. Joe stepped forward without being asked and added a high harmony that didn't belong there. It sounded good. It sounded exciting. It sounded like a man leaving his fingerprints on something and smiling while he did it. When the song ended, Joe let the last chord ring too long and then laughed softly. "See?" Joe said. "Little more edge. People like edge." Jackson looked toward Glenn. Just a glance, a check-in. The old language between friends that said, "Are we okay? Are you going to handle this? Are you going to say something?" Glenn didn't meet his eyes. He clapped his hands once, brisk. "All right," Glenn said. "Next one." That was the moment something inside Jackson shifted. Not in anger, not in shock. In recognition. This wasn't going to be like it used to be. Not with Joe here, not with Glenn refusing to look at him, not with the room watching to see who would bend first. And the worst part was that Jackson had been warned. It had happened 2 months earlier, in a diner off Sunset. The kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like old paper. Jackson had met Glenn there late at night after a show. Glenn looked tired, not physically tired. Glenn always carried himself like he had energy to spare, but tired in a deeper way. The kind of tired that comes from managing people's feelings all day long. They'd ordered burgers, talked about the tour, about the crowds, about how everything was getting bigger faster than anyone expected. Then Glenn leaned back and said, like it was casual, "We're bringing Joe in." Jackson had paused with his fries halfway to his mouth. "Joe Walsh?" Glenn nodded. "Yeah. He's got this thing. He's got swagger. He's got bite. It'll push us. It'll freshen the sound." Jackson chewed slowly. Swallowed. "You sure that's what you need?" Glenn's smile was small, defensive. "You don't think he's good." "I think he's good," Jackson said. "I also think he's a storm." Glenn laughed. "That's what we need, a storm." Jackson didn't laugh. Glenn's eyes narrowed slightly. "What is this? You worried he's going to steal your chords?" Jackson shook his head. "No, I'm worried he's going to steal your peace." Glenn's face changed at that. Not anger, something like fear disguised as amusement. "Come on," Glenn said. "We can handle it." Jackson had looked at him across the table and seen it then, faintly. The pressure, the expectation. The way Glenn's world was getting crowded with people who wanted something from him, label people, fans, critics, bandmates. Jackson had wanted to say, "You don't have to do this. You don't have to keep feeding the machine." But Glenn's eyes had been bright with ambition and exhaustion at the same time. A dangerous mix. After the diner, Jackson ran into a man named Rick at the Troubadour. Rick wasn't Glenn's friend. Rick was the man who made tours happen. The tour manager, the one who lived inside schedules and budgets and arguments and made them look like logistics. Rick had stopped Jackson near the bar and said, "I heard Joe's joining." Jackson nodded. "Yeah?" Rick didn't smile. "Then you need to watch your step around them." Jackson had frowned. "Why?" Rick hesitated, then said, "Because when Joe walks into a room, it changes the temperature. It's not always bad. Sometimes it's what people want. But it turns everything into a contest without anyone admitting they're competing." Jackson had tried to brush it off. "I'm not in their band." Rick's eyes had stayed steady. "That doesn't matter. You're in their orbit, and orbit is enough." Jackson had asked what Rick meant, but Rick had only said, "Just, if you feel it turning, walk away early. Don't wait for it to get ugly." Jackson had nodded, thanked him, filed it away as advice from a tired man. Now, on the rehearsal stage, with Joe smiling like a man who enjoyed pressure, Jackson felt the warning in his bones. They ran the next song. Joe kept pushing, not openly, not in a way that could be called sabotage, just small choices, extra licks, louder fills, joking comments between takes that made the room laugh, and made Jackson feel like the only one not in on the joke. At one point, Joe said, "Loud enough for everyone. Man, you're serious. You always this serious." Jackson didn't answer right away. He adjusted his pick between his fingers, checked his tuning, bought time. Then he said calmly, "I'm focused." Joe grinned. "Same thing." Glenn laughed, quick and automatic. Don didn't. Jackson noticed that too. Don's face stayed controlled, but his eyes moved between Glenn and Joe like he was tracking a fire. After rehearsal, Glenn clapped Jackson on the back. "You're good, man. Crowd's gonna love it." Jackson nodded. "You sure you want me out there with all this going on?" Glenn's smile tightened. "What's going on?" Jackson looked at him, waited. Glenn looked away first. "It's fine. It's just energy." "It doesn't feel like energy," Jackson said. "It's fine," Glenn repeated. "The way people repeat things when they're trying to make them true." Jackson let it go. He didn't push, because pushing never worked. Not with Glenn. Not when Glenn had already decided what he needed to believe. That night, the arena filled. The crowd came in like water, loud and excited, carrying signs and shouting names. Jackson stood in the wings watching Glenn walk out into the light, watching Don settle behind the drums like he was locking himself into place. Watching Joe step forward, soaking up the attention like it was oxygen, the show began. From the crowd's perspective, it was a success. Big songs, big sound, big smiles, the kind of show people talked about on the drive home. The kind that made everyone feel like they were part of something. Backstage, it was different. Between songs, Glenn and Don barely spoke. Joe talked constantly, joked with crew, made comments about the city, flirted with someone near the side stage. The crew laughed, because laughing was safer than not laughing. Jackson waited for his cue. He kept his hands busy, checked his guitar, took slow breaths, stayed calm. When he stepped out on stage, the crowd roared. It felt good for half a second, the warmth of it, the shared memory, the connection. Then he felt Joe's guitar cut in beside him like a blade. They played. Jackson stayed grounded. He didn't compete. He didn't escalate. He played the song like it deserved to be played, like music mattered more than ego. But he felt the crossfire anyway, in glances, in little moments, in the way Glenn leaned toward Joe more than he leaned toward Jackson, in the way Joe stepped closer to Glenn during the chorus like he was claiming territory, in the way Don's drumming got harder when Joe took an extra solo, as if the drums were speaking anger the mouth wouldn't. After the song, Jackson walked off stage into the wings. A stagehand tried to take his guitar. Jackson shook his head and carried it himself. He didn't want anyone else touching it, not because he didn't trust them, because he needed something to be his. Backstage, Glenn hugged him quickly. That was great. Joe came up too, smiling wide. That's how you do it, man. See, we can give it some teeth. Jackson nodded slightly. Yeah. Joe leaned closer, lowering his voice. Don's wound tight tonight. Don't take it personal. Jackson looked at Joe. I'm not. Joe's smile flickered. Good. Because he will. Then Joe walked away, whistling. Jackson stood there, feeling the cold settle deeper. He found Rick near the corridor, speaking into a radio. Rick spotted him and made a small gesture with his chin. Come here. Jackson walked over. Rick's face was tight. You need to leave after your spot. I already played, Jackson said. Then leave now. Jackson frowned. What happened? Rick didn't answer directly. His eyes scanned the hallway. Joe just asked for a change. A change? Rick swallowed. He wants to do another song with you. An unplanned one. He wants you back out there. Jackson blinked. Why? Rick's jaw tightened. Because he wants to prove something. Because Glenn's letting him. Because Don's not going to like it, and Joe likes the fact that don't like it. Jackson felt his stomach drop. Gwen asked me. Rick shook his head. Joe did. Glenn didn't say no. Jackson's mouth went dry. I'm not doing it. Rick exhaled, relief flashing across his face. Good. But then Rick's radio crackled. A voice. Rick, we need Jackson, now. Rick closed his eyes briefly, like he was counting to 3 inside his head. Jackson said quietly, Tell them no. Rick looked at him, eyes full of something like apology. If I tell them no, you become the problem. If you say no yourself, they can't make it about me. Jackson stared at him. That's your warning? Rick's voice was low. My warning is that if you go back out there, the night changes. It won't be a fun guest spot anymore. It'll be a statement. And statements in that band get remembered. Jackson thought about Gwen, about the diner, about the way Glenn had laughed off the storm, about how Glenn always believed he could manage the temperature. Jackson thought about Don, about how Don held things in until they came out sideways, and he thought about Joe, about the way Joe smiled when the room tightened. Then he heard it, Glenn's voice on the stage microphone, booming through the arena. We've got our friend Jackson still here tonight. The crowd roared again. Jackson felt the eyes of crew members on him, people holding their breath, watching to see what he would do. Rick's face went pale. He called you out. Jackson stood very still. He could feel the moment stretching, the moment where he could walk away and become the story, or step into the light and become part of something he didn't want. He remembered Rick's warning from the diner. Orbit is enough. He remembered another warning, too, one he'd given Glenn. I'm worried he's going to steal your piece. He could hear the crowd chanting now. Jackson! 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 Rick leaned in. Jackson! Rick leaned in. Jackson, you don't owe them this. Jackson nodded. He took one breath, then another. He walked toward the stage entrance. Not because he wanted to, because he didn't want Glenn to be alone in the storm he'd invited in. Because he still believed in friendship, even when friendship was messy. Because walking away felt like abandoning someone who didn't even realize he was drowning. He stepped into the wings. A stage tech handed him his guitar like it was a weapon. Jackson strapped it on, adjusted the cable, and waited for his moment to step into the light. Glenn was at the front of the stage, smiling huge, basking in the crowd's love. Joe stood beside him, grinning like a man who just lit a match. Don sat behind the drums, face blank, eyes hard. Glenn gestured toward the wings again. Come on out. Jackson stepped into the light. The crowd exploded. Jackson walked to the microphone, forced his face into a calm expression. He refused to look at Joe. He looked at Glenn. Glenn gave him a bright, grateful smile. Then Joe leaned into his own mic and said, loud enough for the front rows to hear and maybe the cameras too, let's see if we can wake him up. The crowd laughed. Jackson felt the humiliation hit like a slap, not because it was the worst thing anyone had ever said, because it was said in front of thousands, because it turned him into a punchline, because it forced him to choose between reacting and swallowing it. He swallowed it. He looked at Joe calmly. Let's just play. Joe's smile widened. He loved it. Loved that Jackson didn't fight back. Loved that Jackson wouldn't give him a scene to lose. They started the song. Joe played louder than necessary. Glenn leaned into Joe's energy, matching him. The song turned faster, harder. Don's drumming tightened, pushing back. The music began to feel like an argument. Jackson played his part, steady and grounded, but he could feel the song being pulled away from him. Not musically, emotionally. The thing they were doing wasn't about the audience anymore. It was about the band, about proving, about control. Midway through the second verse, Joe changed chords on purpose, just enough to throw Jackson, not a disaster, not a train wreck, but a stumble. Jackson's fingers hesitated for half a second. The crowd didn't notice. Glenn noticed. Glenn's eyes flashed toward Joe, then toward Jackson, then away. Glenn kept singing, smiling, performing. Jackson corrected instantly, found his way back, kept the song moving. He didn't glare. He didn't stop. He didn't make it obvious. But inside, something snapped cleanly. Not anger at Joe, not even anger at Glenn. A realization. This was the bond being destroyed, not in a dramatic fight, not in a headline, in these moments, in the way Glenn chose the show over the friendship, in the way Joe used humor like a blade and the room called it energy, in the way Don's silence acted like permission. They finished the song. The crowd roared. Glenn threw an arm around Joe's shoulders and raised Joe's hand like a boxer. Joe basked. Don stayed behind the drums, face still hard. Jackson stood at the microphone for a moment with his guitar hanging heavy against his body. Glenn leaned toward him, still smiling. That was killer, right? Jackson looked at Glenn. He could see the sweat on Glenn's forehead, the adrenaline in his eyes. Glenn looked alive. Like the storm had done exactly what Glenn wanted it to do, made the night feel electric. Jackson wanted to tell him quietly, "You're not alive. You're burning." But he didn't say it. Not there, not in front of everyone. He just nodded. Yeah. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked off the stage into the wings without waving to the crowd. It wasn't rude, it wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. It was the first time Jackson allowed himself to make a choice that didn't serve the show. Backstage, Rick was waiting. Rick's face looked like a man who'd watched a car crash happen in slow motion. "You okay?" Jackson nodded once. "Get me out of here." Rick didn't ask questions, he just moved. He guided Jackson through a side corridor, past crew members who looked away, past security guards who pretended not to see. Rick got him to a back exit where the air was cold and smelled like diesel. Jackson stood outside the building for a moment, listening to the muffled sound of the show still going on inside. The crowd screaming, the band playing, the machine moving forward as if nothing had happened. Rick leaned close. "You did good." Jackson didn't look at him. "No, I didn't." Rick's voice was tired. "You didn't explode. You didn't give them a scene. You got out with your dignity." Jackson finally looked at Rick. "My dignity isn't the point." "What is the point?" Rick asked. Jackson swallowed hard. "The point is, I just watched my friend choose the storm." Rick didn't reply right away. Then he said gently, "Glenn didn't choose the storm because he loves pain. He chose it because he's scared. He's scared of losing the band, scared of losing control, scared of being ordinary again." Jackson looked down at his hands. His fingers were still slightly numb. Rick continued, quieter. "Joe's not a villain either. He's trying to belong. He's trying to prove he deserves the seat he just got. He's been the guy on the outside before. He's scared too. He just turns his fear into jokes." Jackson leaned his head back against the cold wall of the arena. The truth of that hit him in the chest. It didn't make the night feel better. It just made it sadder. Rick pushed off the wall. "Go. Before the show ends. Before somebody wants to talk. Before they try to make it normal again." Jackson nodded. He got into his car and drove away. In the rearview mirror, the arena lights glowed like a fire. The sound faded quickly once he hit the freeway. The city opened around him, indifferent and enormous. He didn't go to the after-party. He didn't call Glenn. He didn't call Dunn. He didn't call Dunn. He didn't call Joe. He went back to his hotel room and sat in silence. His phone rang twice. He didn't answer. The next morning, he woke up to a message. Glenn's voice cheerful, like he was calling to thank him for helping with yard work. "Hey man, great seeing you. Crowd loved it. Sorry about the cord thing, that was weird. Anyway, safe travels." Jackson listened to the message twice. Sorry about the cord thing, like it was an accident. Like it was weather. Like it wasn't a choice. Jackson deleted the message, then sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the carpet. He didn't feel rage, he felt grief. The kind that comes when you realize a bond is breaking and nobody around you wants to name it. The kind that comes when you know the moment you speak the truth out loud, it becomes real in a way it can't be reversed. A week later, he ran into Glenn at a studio in Los Angeles. Not a big confrontation, not a planned meeting. Just two men in a hallway with posters on the wall and someone's music leaking under a door. Glenn smiled when he saw him. "Jackson, hey!" Jackson nodded. "Hey!" Glenn stepped closer, energy high. "Man, that show was insane. Joe's a maniac, right? He brings this spark." Jackson looked at Glenn. He saw it clearly now. Glenn's eyes were bright, but behind the brightness was something frantic, like a man who had to keep moving or he'd fall apart. "Glenn," Jackson said quietly, "what happened on that second song?" Glenn's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. A flicker, a moment of calculation. "What do you mean?" Glenn asked. "The chord change, the monitor, the way the whole thing turned." Glenn laughed lightly. "Man, you're reading too much into it. That's rock and roll. Stuff happens. Joe gets wild. People love it." Jackson held Glenn's gaze. "Did you love it?" Glenn's smile tightened. "I love that the crowd was happy." "That's not what I asked." Glenn's face changed then. The charm drained out, replaced by something hard. "You got a problem with Joe," Glenn said. "Not a question." Jackson shook his head. "No. I have a problem with you not looking at me when it mattered." Glenn's jaw flexed. "You think I'm supposed to babysit everybody's feelings now? I've got a band. I've got a tour. I've got a label. I've got 10,000 people every night expecting us to be the Eagles. I don't have time to manage your sensitivity." Jackson felt the words hit, not because they were cruel, because they were honest. Glenn was telling him plainly where he stood now. "I'm not asking you to manage my sensitivity," Jackson said, calm. "I'm asking you to recognize when someone is using me as a prop." Glenn stared at him. For a moment his eyes softened, like something inside him knew Jackson was right, like the old bond tried to rise to the surface. Then Glenn swallowed it back down. "I can't do this," Glenn said quietly. "Not here. Not now." Jackson nodded. "Okay." Glenn stepped back, already closing the door emotionally. "We're fine, Jackson." Jackson didn't argue. He just said, "No, we're not." Glenn turned away and walked down the hallway, leaving Jackson standing there with the truth in his mouth and nowhere to put it. They didn't have a big falling out after that. No screaming. No headlines. No dramatic final phone call. It was quieter. Worse. Glenn stopped calling. Jackson stopped reaching. When they saw each other at events, they nodded politely, smiled the way people smile when they're trying to prove nothing hurts. Joe Walsh stayed in the band. The Eagles got bigger. The shows got louder. The machine ran hotter. And Jackson carried that night with him like a bruise you don't show anyone. Not because he wanted revenge. Not because he wanted credit. Because he couldn't stop thinking about the moment Glenn didn't look at him. The moment Glenn chose the storm over the bond. Years later, Jackson would sit alone with his guitar and write a song that didn't name anyone but carried the feeling anyway. The feeling of being invited into a room and realizing you're only welcome as long as you don't take up space. The feeling of watching a friend become someone you can't reach anymore. The feeling of a bond being destroyed, not by hatred, but by hunger. He never explained that song in interviews, never pointed fingers. He let people hear what they heard, because he understood something now that Rick had been trying to warn him about. Sometimes the warning isn't about danger in the obvious sense. It's about the slow kind of danger, the kind that doesn't break your bones, the kind that breaks your trust. And the hardest part is that no one person is evil in those stories. Not Glenn, not Joe, not Doan. They were human, tired, proud, scared, trying to hold on to something that felt like identity. That didn't make what happened okay. It just meant there was no one to defeat, no villain to expose, no clean ending where someone apologized and everything went back to how it was. The bond didn't die in one moment. It died in the series of choices. Small ones, quiet ones, choices made in the name of keeping the show moving. Jackson used to think bonds broke because someone stopped caring. Now he knew something else. Sometimes bonds break because someone cares too much about the wrong thing. And when he thought back to that rehearsal stage, the empty seats rising into darkness, the work lights buzzing, the crew pretending not to listen, he could still hear Joe's voice. "We're doing it your way tonight, or the way that doesn't put people to sleep." Jackson could still see Glenn's smile. And he could still feel the moment he realized the warning wasn't about Joe joining the Eagles. It was about what Joe's arrival would awaken in everyone else. The storm didn't create their fear. It just gave it a soundtrack. Jackson kept writing, kept touring, kept building his own rooms where songs could breathe without turning into contests. He learned to walk away earlier, learned to trust the tightness in the air when a place stopped being safe. He never hated them. He never wished them harm. He never told the story like a courtroom argument. He just carried it quietly, like a scar that didn't ask to be admired, only remembered. And some nights, when the crowd was loud and the lights were bright, and he could feel that old pressure trying to return, he would take a breath, lean into the microphone, and choose the one thing he could still control. He would choose to stay himself, even if it meant losing people who once felt like home.